That's a prime example of just kind of knowing what to expect and just planning on that. Okay, but I think that when this first started, and you're right, this is not really new. There's been guys doing this for 10 years or more, but I think it's a little bit of a shock up front. They kind of blow some of this on, or they fly it on, and then they don't get a real good stand, and they're like, well, what the heck happened? Well, if you want the same amount of stand, you're going to have to put on a lot more seed to get the same germination rate. If you're not that concerned about it, it's not a big deal. And there's still plenty of folks that broadcast, and that's going to be the same type of deal. You're going to have to put some more seed down to get the same level of germination that you would with a drill. Okay, so just a couple of seeding scenarios just to kind of give you a feel for what types of species are popular or whatever, and maybe a little bit about the seed cost that you can expect. Because like I said on the front end, you can spend as much money as you want, but that generally isn't necessary if you just kind of take a look at what you're trying to do and what species fit that mix. So let's just look at a July, August following cereal grain somewhere in there. You're probably going to do an oats. You might throw in some millet because you got a lot of growing season left, and that millet's going to be able to get up and going. You get after this time window right here, and I probably would just stay away from any of the summer annuals because you're just not going to have enough growing season left to do it. And then throw some brassicas in there, and we're still under $30 an acre on seed cost, and you sure could drive that down further if you wanted to, depending on what you're trying to do. So this is just an example of doing some cover crops after silage, obviously a little further south than here. And you bring up a good point with the herbicide deal. You got to be aware of what your herbicide residues are and how that matches up with the species you're trying to use when you try and do these double cropping systems. They're very effective, but they've got to be managed pretty tightly. And so
residue is the secondary to the legal requirements.
Pardon me?
The residue, the chemical residue is secondary to the legal requirements on the label, because companies are not going to spend millions of dollars to get labeled for these minor crops. You're going to get a handful of crops of soybean and some corn and maybe some cereal grains that have a crop rotation requirement. Most of these cover crop mixes are going to fall into all other crops. It can be as long as 18 months.
Right.
So don't do anything illegal.
Thank you. And so, yes, and that's an excellent point. And if you were in that type of situation, you might think about a mixture like this with some oats and just a brassica. There's really no need to go any more than that just because of the amount of growing season you got left. It's pretty minimal. So there's no reason to get real creative with the types of species that you use. Keep the cost as low as possible and go from there. And then, I mentioned on the front end, now with some of the changes in crop insurance, we're starting to see a little bit more of this. Putting in some a type of cover crop on with the intent that we're going to graze the stalks after the cash crop is harvested. And this is probably an extreme example. You probably could just put in some ryegrass or another type of high protein plant that's relatively cheap and just go that way. Okay, so that's another one. You don't have to get real creative on it for it to be very, very effective, and you can keep the cost pretty low. Probably the most frequently asked question I get is basically stocking rates. How much capacity am I going to get out of this? Obviously, it depends a lot on what you plant, but just as a general rule of thumb, if you're in that late July to August when you plant, figure at least a half a cow to the acre. Okay, this July, that should be mid-August. If it's mid-August to early September, figure on at least an acre to the cow, and after early September, 1.5 to 2 acres plus per cow per month. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Good comments. I appreciate you adding those to this deal because you kind of go along and you forget some of this as you go along.
When you graze those brassicas, do you ever find the cows, do they just graze the top off, or do they ever pull that pull on that root and pull it out.
Yeah, usually what they do is they go over it once and graze a lot of the tops off, and they'll do this in patches around the field unless you're like really strip grazing them or something. So they'll go around and they'll nip all the tops off, and then they'll come back and pull the tuber out.
They do pull that tuber out.
Yeah, and they don't. I've done some research because you know the thing that we've kind of struggled with a little bit in terms of stocking rate is, well, how much of these tubers do they eat? How do you figure that into your stocking rate? So I did a couple of studies to look at, well, how much of the tuber do they actually eat? Well, they actually don't eat a lot of it. You'll see turnips that they pull up and they eat, and they do eat them, and they do eat a lot of them, but as a comparison of the total number that are out in the field, it's actually a very small percentage. So you figure that into your stocking rate a little bit, but not as much as you might think on the front end.
Where's most of the value, in the top green or in the tuber?
In the top green.
That's where the most of the
Yeah,
value
that's where
is.
your protein's at. The tops will run 18-19% protein when they're green and growing. The tubers will run, you know, maybe 10 or 11%, which is still good.
They're still good.
Yeah, but not quite as high. But there's a little more dry matter in that tuber, and I think that's what they're actually trying to get at. Yes.
Are you using a forage oat?
Yes.
Or what are you using?
Well, a lot of these is just like a Mustang oat. The forage oats, that's fine, but you're not going to plant anything with a forage oat because it's going to shade it out. And I wouldn't probably, if you're going to graze, you can graze them obviously, but a lot with the forage oats, a lot of time, there's so much material out there, you can't effectively graze it. So if you plant a forage oat, I'd probably plan on mechanically harvesting it, either chopping it or whatever. In this country, it might be a little tough to get it dry for dry hay, so you're probably going to be chopping it.
One cheap insurance policy I found when grazing cover crops is usually I like to put a round bale of grass hay out there.
Yes.
Because you wouldn't think so, but they will regulate their dryment. Because I do a lot of cereal grazings and turnips and stuff.
Yeah.
But they will, if you offer it to them, they will regulate themselves a little bit for dry matter if you give them some decent.
Yes, that's a very good point, and that is very, very true. They will seek that dry hay out if they get too loaded up on wet material. And a lot of folks confuse that with trying to keep them from bloating. And I don't know what you've seen, but I've never seen cows have a problem with bloat. Calves, now I've done a fair amount of research with calves on these cover crops. I've never actually had them bloat, but I'm not much of a risk taker, so I always put some type of Rumensin carrier out there, whether it's in the mineral or feed them a supplement with some Rumensin in it, just so they have it, so we don't bloat them up. But like I say, I've never actually seen any problems really with bloat on calves, but that's not to say it can't happen.
See, and I usually see a lot of red clover in there too.
Yeah.
And some of mine have a pretty high percentage of red clover by that time.
Yeah.
Some of my fields will be a forage barley that I'll cut for hay and I'll interseed red clover.
Yep.
And then I'll come in with a cereal, rye, and turnips and oats and
Yes.
that. But the clovers will be there. I haven't ever had problems with that, but I do strip graze. And then I do offer a grass bale.
Yeah, if they don't have the opportunity to just pick out all the candy, that'll take